Hello, OSA fans. Today, we'll be starting at the dawn of biological time, billions and billions and billions of years ago, when the Earth was new, not quite molten lava and all destroyed, but a little bit after that. Back then, there was no oxygen. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and every critter that you know that needs oxygen did not exist. They're just tiny little critters that were, bacteria, very simple, and they're eating and killing each other and eating inorganic molecules, and life was relatively boring unless you were a microbiologist. And then something happened that was great. What happened was great extinction. Somewhere along the line in that great soup of primordial critters, one critter, or probably a set of them, that we now know as cyanobacteria, figured out a trick that we now know as photosynthesis. And they coupled this trick with nitrogen fixation. So by being able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and use it as a substrate, they were able to take light energy and make their own food from it. And we take that for granted today, but back then, billions of years ago, that was some disruptive ass stuff. Basically, it was disruptive because not a single other critter, including the cyanobacteria, was used to oxygen. Oxygen was toxic to them. So what happened is as the cyanobacteria grew, they became the dominant force, and they were being so successful because they could make food when no one else could. They essentially filled the atmosphere full of oxygen and induced the first great extinction that biologists know today. After that happens, oxygen saturates the atmosphere, all the other critters die, and then the few handful of photosynthetic organisms evolve. And then what they start to do is they start eating each other. It's fascinating because when they eat each other, at least not in all circumstances, the organism that's eaten doesn't necessarily die. Now what happens is that long ago, a cyanobacteria was eaten by one of those other critters that was heterotrophic, that was like, oh no, I'm done. You got this power and I'm just gonna eat you. But instead of digesting you, because I'll die eventually, you're gonna work for me now. I'm gonna strip you of everything that made you independent, and you're gonna live inside me, and you're going to make food for me using that photosynthetic magic that you did. And basically what that happened is when that guy ate that cyanobacteria, that became a chlorophyll. That is where green algae began. Now, a bunch of other events like this happened where things were eating each other but not quite killing them and then getting assimilated. And as things got more complicated, they acquired more and more organisms and became more and more diverse. And that's where our green algae came from, which eventually led up to our plants. That's where the brown algae, the red algae, and then eventually, because of this oxygen-rich atmosphere, we were allowed to exist. So this happened billions and billions and billions of years ago. And if you remember your PBS dinosaur documentaries, dinosaurs are hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago. So when you think of you and let's say like an ancient flatworm, you guys are close cousins compared to that Ketomorpha green algae and this Halimenia red algae. So with all that as background, today, I wanted to say that because you have to consider that because algae have been around for billions and billions of years now, they have evolved to do everything. And because of that, there are good algae, there are bad algae, and there are ugly algae. So today, we'll be going through all the different general types of algae that we can very briefly. Now we'll start with the bad and the ugly because we'll do separate videos on them. Now there's ugly algae that grows in your tank. It might not necessarily hurt anything, but it can be aesthetically unattractive. So that's like that red slime in reef tanks, that cyanobacteria, or hair algae, or black tough algae in freshwater tanks. That's ugly algae. We'll have separate videos on that. There's also bad algae. There's algae that doesn't want to do the photosynthetic thing. It wants to be a parasite. So there's a particular disease that affects clownfish called saltwater velvet. That's actually an amylodinium. So that is a saltwater dinoflagellate algae, which has given up the whole photosynthetic thing altogether, and it's decided that it's going to make its living latching onto the skin of clownfish and tapping them. So that's bad algae. What we'll be talking about a little bit for the rest of this video is the good algae. Because we have to keep in mind that even though there are pest algae and there are parasitic algae, the broad majority of algae, even today, science does not completely understand them. They have created the world that we live in, and we, as in us, corals, crabs, snails, fish, have all evolved to be with them. and to work with them. So by knowing and understanding that the broad majority of algae are good, we can understand what exactly they've been up to this whole time and how we can use them to make our aquariums beautiful. One of the classic examples I like to use with good algae is stuff that belongs in refugiums. Now there's microalgae that exists as like little colors and might show up as little diatoms or hazing up your sand, and there's macroalgae. Now there's still algae, they're independent cells, but they manifest into these giant structures that we call seaweed. So one of the most popular in the aquarium trade because it's so bulletproof is called Ketomorpha. Now this is probably Ketomorpha lilinum, but there's a bunch of different subspecies and hybrids. But long story short, this is spaghetti algae. I love this stuff because it's evolved to be in pretty much most estuarine, aquatic marine ecosystems across the world. You can find this stuff off in Watch Hill Reef up in Westerly, and you can find it in Bermuda, you can find it in the Philippines. What this stuff does is essentially it wants to absorb all of the ammonia that it can in a system. It loves ammonia. Ammonia is like its gasoline, and it's constantly sucking it out of the system. And as we've covered before in the nitrogen cycle, ammonia is a horrible thing for fish. Now, if it can't get ammonia, it's going to have to get nitrite and nitrate, stuff that it doesn't like as much. So by having Ketomorpha inside our aquariums and coupling that with a really strong, robust biofilter, we essentially are stripping all of the fish waste out from multiple different directions. And all of a sudden, we not only have Ketomorpha, we have Halimenia or Gracilaria or any other macroalgae in the refugium. We're stripping all those different surplus waste items all at the same time. And it's by having this beautiful biological synchrony that wild coral reefs operate in the first place. Ketomorpha also has this awesome trick where it's able to super saturate the area around it once it's doing well. It's able to super saturate the area around it with oxygen. And that essentially is taking our little lesson from the beginning and pushing it to the extreme, where organisms that normally would do nice if the oxygen levels weren't too high would get shocked and killed. So this guy is really good at depleting waste algae, waste bacteria, and other things incidentally just by growing. So it's by having lots of good macroalgae inside a refugium that we really can be playing into algae's primary superpower, which is being a nitrate and phosphate fiend. Algae can do a lot of things. They can prevent other algae from growing, they can strip waste out of the reef, but most importantly, algae are the foundation of all nutrition in the reef and in freshwater ecosystems. So we'll have a separate video specifically on the best aspects of algae nutrition, but none of the nutrition possible in any of these clownfish, pipefish, starfish, any of these organisms would not have their coloration. They wouldn't be able to form their complex organs if it weren't for things called PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're essentially golden fats that only a handful of organisms in the world can produce. And spoiler alert, algae represent most of the taxa that can make those vital PUFAs that are necessary for everything. But the last thing we'll talk about in this brief introduction to algae is all of the reefs, all of the corals that you see here at our store. And then some of the anemones and some of the clams as well. But these organisms, because you love corals, you already recognize what a beautiful balance nature can have, where you have organisms like us. Corals are not algae, but they have fused themselves with algae. And because of that, they're able to grow off our lights, they're able to grow all these fantastic colors, and they're able to use the algae and the nutrition to basically form and manifest all this collective beauty that we recognize as, oh, that's a je ne sais quoi beautiful coral. Algae, good, bad, ugly, and beautiful. There is no way of getting around it. You will have to interact with it at some point in a tank, no matter what aquarium you choose, freshwater, saltwater. But by appreciating it and by knowing what you're dealing with, you can turn algae into your best friend.